My name is Crispin B. Hollinshead. I'm part of Keep the Lights On in Ukiah, a collection of members of the Climate Action Mendocino group. The short story is PG&E power down blackouts in the summertime are bad for business and bad for our community. The solution is some local power production in the valley. Modern electrical grid system consists of two parts: the transmission system and the distribution system. The transmission system is the high voltage lines on steel towers you see marching across the countryside. The distribution system are the poles and wires, lower voltage, that run along the roadsides and deliver power to each house and business. In Mendocino County, almost all of the distribution system is owned by Pacific Gas and Electric, and all of the transmission system is owned by PG&E. In Ukiah, within the city limits, we have our own utility district, which means that we own the distribution system, but almost all of our power is shipped in from the outside world over the PG&E lines. One line coming in from the east along Route 20, and another line coming up from the south along Highway 101 roughly. Either one of those lines can power the city. In Ukiah Valley, there's a substation on the transmission grid which feeds the city of Ukiah and two Pacific Gas and Electric circuits, one to the north and one to the south, as far as Potter Valley to the northeast and down to Retech in the south. In 2019, Pacific Gas and Electric started implementing a public safety power shutdown program, PSPS. This program was initiated after several destructive fire seasons where their equipment was at fault. The plan is, whenever there is an appropriate weather condition, a red flag weather condition, PG&E will de-energize either portions of the grid or portions of their distribution system in order to prevent the ignition of fires. In 2019, there were 5 red flag events. The first one of these was on Wednesday, October 9th, and extended for 2 days until Friday, October 11th. During that time, the 2 PG&E distribution grids in Ukiah Valley were de-energized, but the transmission grid was not, so Ukiah was powered up. The second red flag event happened a few weeks later on Wednesday, October 23rd. And again, there were some of the distribution lines that PG&E owned were de-energized in Mendocino County, but the main transmission system from the south was still active, so Ukiah was still powered up. Although that evening, the Kincaid fire started to the south. There was a second red flag warning, actually number 3, on Saturday, October 26th. And PG&E warned the city of Ukiah that we would lose our power. The transmission system was going to shut down that evening, and it did at 7 o'clock. And at that time, pretty much all of Mendocino County was dark. A few days later, on Tuesday, October 29th, the red flag condition was extended for another day, and so everybody was still dark. Until Wednesday, October 30th, the transmission grid was re-energized, so Ukiah was lit up, and the next day on Thursday, October 31st, the rest of Mendocino was energized. Some of the distribution systems were a little slower coming up. And finally, the 5th red flag event, PSPS event, was Wednesday, November 20th, which only affected the areas around Hopland within Mendocino County, and that lasted a day. The economic consequences of being dark in Ukiah were significant. There were 4 days of lost business, which has amounted to $7 million in revenue. There was another $600,000 in lost food for residential and another $400,000 in lost food for restaurants and supermarkets, for a total economic hit for that one 4-day event of $8 million. And that's actually probably a conservative estimate because it doesn't include things like wages for businesses that don't produce sales taxes, overtime for first responders and critical services and all that. To put this in perspective though, 2019 was a relatively light fire season. In 2018, instead of the 5 red flag events we experienced in 2019, there were 19 of those events. And while the PSPS program was not in place at that time, if it had been, there's a good chance that we would have had much more blackout than what we experienced in 2019. The weather events that caused the grid to shut down weren't in Ukiah Valley, but they affected us here. So the solution is to have some power produced within the valley. Now, there are 3 basic possibilities for power production here. Fossil fuel generation, hydroelectric from the Lake Mendocino Dam, and renewable and storage. Each of those have advantages and disadvantages. Generators are expensive, and most of the time they're sitting idle, 99% of the time, which means it's a sunk investment. It doesn't help us during the rest of the time. The fuel costs produce energy at 4 times the normal rate, not including the cost of the generator. To adequately install and store fuel for an extended event takes some planning and expense. Not everybody can afford a generator, and generators are noisy and contribute to air pollution. Generators are a 20th century solution to a 21st century problem. The dam at Lake Mendocino has 2 generators, a 1 and 2.5 megawatt units. They can produce about 8 to 12% of the normal load of Ukiah if there's water behind the dam. And in fire seasons, that can be problematic. But that generation should be included in any emergency kind of planning that we want to do. Keep the lights on is recommending that we go for option 3, which is renewable energy and storage. In the Ukiah Valley, we don't have commercial wind, but we do have sun. As I said earlier, solar energy can be used all the time. It can help provide power during normal times as well as being available during emergencies. Ukiah burns on the average of 300 megawatt hours a day. It goes up about a third in the summer and it drops a little bit in the winter, but that's our average target. 25% of the energy we consume is produced by brown power. And California law says that by 2045, every utility has to have 0% brown power, heading toward renewable, 100% renewable. So Keep the Lights On is suggesting we aim for what we call the 30% solution. If we had 30% of our normal power in an emergency during the late fall, which is a solar minimum, we would be able to survive. Businesses could stay open, people could keep sheltered in their homes, have refrigeration, communication. That's what we're aiming at. So given that we want an average of 300 megawatt hours a day, 30% of that is 90 megawatt hours a day. And the way solar works is in Ukiah we have between 3.5 and 6.5 Newt equivalent hours over the course of the year. And what that means is in the wintertime, a 1 megawatt array would produce 3.5 megawatt hours. And so we want to be able to be emergency prepared in the solar minimum. So to be conservative, we'll use a number of 3 hours, and that means a 90 megawatt hour load could be provided by a 30 megawatt array. And then added to that, we would want on the order of 100 megawatt hour to 125 megawatt hour battery so that we can store power during the day to be able to use in the evening. Because what we want is not only to have our businesses to be open some part of the day, but we want everybody's home to be powered up all through the night so that refrigeration and freezers work. People with medical needs can keep alive. And so we want to have an array plus storage. These sizes, 30 megawatt array and 100 megawatt hour battery, are large compared to a home, but they're modest compared to utility scale installations, which are being put in place all the time, all over the world, including here in California. The point is, this hardware is getting cheaper. The solar arrays are getting more efficient. The costs are coming down and the battery capacity is going up. So at the very time we need this kind of alternative, we have it available. It's feasible. We could do this. Of course, everybody wants to know, what's this going to cost? And the bottom line is, it's expensive. This 30% solution could cost as much as $150 million. But it's important to remember, what are we already paying in order to have comparison? The wholesale power bill for Ukiah is about $7 million a year right now. If you take a fixed ground mount array, solar array, and finance it over 30 years, the power costs exactly the same. So that's not a heavy lift. The batteries need to be financed in a different way. But there is a concept called load shaving, where the power in the evening is more expensive than the power in the middle of the day. So we can store solar energy in the middle of the day and use it in the evening to replace paying for the expensive power. And in normal times, this could save about a quarter of the battery cost. Now, all of this can be modified by how it's funded. Grants could come into it. There are tax rebates and depreciation schedules that can be taken advantage of. Although Ukiah can't be as a municipal entity, private investors can, and they could build these systems for us, creating a power purchase agreement where some of those savings get passed on to us and we wind up with an affordable cost system. Another important part of this is these would be fixed costs. If you buy a solar array today, you're basically prepaying 30 years of power. In a time where costs are definitely not fixed, this is also an advantage. Even if it looks a little more expensive now, in the long run, it may turn out to be a great savings. The other thing to realize is costs are going to go up no matter what. PG&E is going to have to rebuild their grid system, and customers are going to wind up paying for that. And even though Ukiah doesn't buy power from PG&E, it's shipped on their system, so the shipping charges are going to go up. We know that. The other part of it is we're already paying the $7 million for our power, but we also paid $8 million last year for the power shutdown. That's a lot of money. What's it worth for power resilience? What's it worth to have stability in power instead of the potential uncertainty of blackouts? And this blackout we had this last summer, which was only 4 days, could have been 7 days if the grid from the south had been shut down on the Wednesday night when the Kincaid fire started. And that would have driven our costs up by another $5 million. We're in a new normal. For the 100 years that there's been commercial electricity, power's always been generated when it's needed and used immediately. We're now in an era where power needs to be collected when it's available and stored so that we can have it when it's needed. So if you like this idea and you think that there's an advantage to having some local power for power emergencies and resiliency, there are a number of things you can do. The key player in all this will be the Ukiah City Council. They're the ones that have to decide, yes, this is worth doing, and then they can make it happen. But we as citizens need to help convince the City Council that this is worth doing. If you live in Ukiah, then you definitely have an advantage and should get in touch with your city council and let them know. But even if you live out in the outer regions where you've got PG&E power, it's to your advantage to have Ukiah energized during an emergency. Even if your power goes down, you can come into town, buy gasoline, your grocery stores are open, you can go to restaurants, get a hot meal, recharge your electronics. So everybody in the Ukiah area will benefit if Ukiah City has some resiliency. There are several ways that you can communicate with the city. You can call 463-6200 and leave a message. You can email the city council members who are involved in looking into this, Mayor Doug Crane and Steve Scalmanini. Their email addresses are on the screen in front of you. And finally, even though the city council is not meeting in public right now because of the coronavirus problem, this will pass and we will be back into business at some point. The city council allows public comments at the beginning of every one of their meetings. Their meetings are held the first and third Wednesday of every month at 6 p.m. in the Ukiah Civic Center. Finally, if you like this idea, talk to everybody you know. Encourage them to look into it. Have them start thinking about it and spread the word. At the bottom of the page you see there's an email address, ktlo@mcn.org, and there's also a website for the Climate Action Mendocino. If you need more information or want to get involved, you can find out. That's about it. Keep the lights on in Ukiah. Thank you.